Welcome to the Gospel of Mark, session 2. And we're looking at a really nifty little story today, the stilling of the storm in Mark 4, which is short but has all sorts of things packed into it. So I hope you'll enjoy exploring that and discussing that today.
So the lectionary for this Sunday gives us an account from Mark's Gospel of the crossing of the lake when the disciples and Jesus are caught in a storm. Some introductory stuff about the compilation of Mark's Gospel. This is one of a number of miracle stories, quite a number of miracle stories that we find in Mark's Gospel. It's widely thought now amongst biblical scholars that the stories we have in the Gospels were originally told by word of mouth. They were probably told and retold in the gatherings of the early Jesus movement as people remembered Jesus and were taught about what he said and what he did. And of course, the ancient world was predominantly an oral society, unlike the contemporary Western world, which was for a while a very print-based society, but now we're very much a visual-oriented society with TV and screens and tablets, etc. But oral culture meant stories were told and remembered and retold and passed on. And it was probably after some decades of that Mark decided, was the first person that we know of that decided that he would actually collect those stories and write them down into what eventually formed the Gospel according to Mark. And we can see the various kinds of material that Mark would have had access to. Chapter 4, most of chapter 4 of the Gospel is a series of parables and Jesus teaching in parables and talking about what it means to teach in parables. We saw some of those parables last week. Jesus also spoke about the coming kingdom and about the signs of the times, what would be happening in the time leading up to the implementation of the kingdom. And we get that in chapter 13 in this speech where he talks about the coming end of time. So it's believed that both of these chapters, chapter 4 and chapter 13, probably started as oral remembrances of Jesus that were passed on by word of mouth. There are also, in the first 10 chapters of Mark's Gospel, there are very many miracles that are told, healings and exorcisms and nature miracles. And some of them, a number of them are clustered. There's a cluster from about the middle of chapter 1 through to early in chapter 2. And there's another cluster, which this story that we're looking at tonight starts towards the end of chapter 4 and then through into chapter 5. Those sections of the Gospel have just one miracle after another, and probably were oral stories that Mark has put together for the benefit of his writing. When we look at not only Mark's Gospel, but across all 4 Gospels, we see that there's a lot of things that Jesus was said to have done to cure illnesses, a whole lot of different illnesses like fever, leprosy, paralysis, hemorrhaging, deafness, blindness. And in Luke's Gospel, the woman who's bent over double, it's probably something like a fusion of bones in the spine. There are stories where Jesus engages with demons who were possessing individuals when he confronts the demons and commands them to come out from those individuals. And we can see that demonic possession was probably manifested in the body in ways that we recognize as medical conditions like epilepsy or mutism or blindness in various stories. There are three of the Gospels that contain stories that claim that Jesus was able to raise people who appeared to be dead. Mark chapter 5, Luke 7, and John 11, the famous story of Lazarus. And there are accounts of nature miracles performed by Jesus, stilling the storm, walking on water, healing a fig tree, catching an abundance of fish, and turning water into wine. So a number of ways in which Jesus was able to break the expected pattern of nature. And then, of course, there's the story that's told a number of times about the feeding of the large crowd, feeding of 4,000, feeding of 5,000. So Jesus, as a miracle worker, was a significant remembrance of him. And because Mark is the shortest gospel, and because there are so many miracle stories, healings and exorcisms and the like in Mark's gospel, it's quite a high concentration that's devoted to this aspect of Jesus' activity. So the story that we've got tonight, the stilling of the storm, comes from this collection of miracles performed by Jesus. And we're going to think about it firstly in relation to some Psalms.
Yes. Just before we get to the Psalms, a comment. I've talked before about the magical papyri, and there was a lot of healers and exorcists of the day. One of the things that differentiates Jesus quite clearly from these people are these nature miracles, because where you might find a spell to perhaps whip up a storm, I don't know, there's a spell to calm one down, there may be. There's nothing that's parallel to the sort of thing that Jesus does in these miracles in terms of things like stilling storms with a word, walking on water, healing, bringing dead trees back to life, finding abundant fish, etc. That seems to be quite unique to Jesus. One of the sources, perhaps, of this particular miracle story that we have this evening, the stilling of the storm, can be found in the Psalms. If you notice in Psalm 107, it says that they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. And there does seem to be some similarity between what's expressed in this psalm and this miracle in Mark, which is also found in Luke and Matthew. And again in Psalm 89, we can find, you rule the raging of the sea, when its waves rise, you still them. So this idea that God stills the storm, if you like. So we have a question for you to think about. How might the early followers of Jesus have heard this story, particularly in the light of these Psalms? And what would these Psalms suggest about how we are to understand Jesus in this story, or indeed how we understand how might be shaping this story? Is it accidental that there seems to be a reference to what the Psalms say, or is there something deeper going on? Well, welcome back, everyone. How did you go with this question?
Well, it was suggested that it was actually demonic, in that Jesus used the same words as he rebuked a demon.
That's certainly what the Pharisees suggest in some of the versions of that. But it's also used, this word, it's ekballo, and it means to hurl or do something with force. It's also what the Holy Spirit does to Jesus when he's baptized. It ekballos him or hurls him out into the wilderness. So you can see this word is not confined to the dark arts, as it were. If it's used to describe the Holy Spirit's action in terms of driving Jesus into the wilderness.
When you use a word like rebuke, you're rebuking something or someone. There's an object, and Jesus is obviously rebuking who's ever causing the storm.
Well, he could just be rebuking the storm, Gary. It doesn't have to have any sinister meaning.
It's an unusual storm. It's a lot worse than most storms on the Lake of Galilee, apparently.
Well, it is in one gospel. It is not in the other gospels. And if you've read it, you would, when we get onto that, when John does the things, you'll realise that it is in Matthew. You're quite right. It's just a windstorm in Luke and Mark.
Yeah.
In Matthew, it's an earthquake, so it is much more severe and it probably is supernatural. So you could make that case, I think, with that gospel, but we're looking at Mark at the moment, and particularly in the light of the Psalms. Anyone got a suggestion to make about the connection with the Psalms?
We thought that perhaps it showed that Jesus had the same power as God.
Yes, I reckon that you're onto something, Dorothy.
And
Your
therefore
anonymous friend there.
and therefore pointed to the Trinity, in fact.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going that far, but it's certainly saying that the power that God had to still storms seems to exist in Jesus.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that he both commanded the storm and he raised the storm. So it seems that on this particular occasion, he was doing it to demonstrate something, his power.
Well, I don't know Jesus is raising the storm here. The storm just comes up. But in the Psalms, certainly it says that God commands and raises the stormy wind. He lifts the waves of the sea. And then when people cry out, he can still them.
Yeah.
I think that's suggesting God's in command of everything in Psalm 107.
I think Jesus was showing that he was actually part of the Godhead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable deduction, particularly as this audience of Jesus initially is Jewish. Though John's going to talk about how that's being challenged in this particular story, but they would have known these Psalms. So hearing this story would have evoked Psalm 107 and 89. And you might say, well, are you sure you knew them? They knew them, yes, because people learn things off by heart. They sung these Psalms, they used them in worship, and they would have been one of the parts, along with the Torah, that people would have known by memory. We're very slack now about remembering things because we don't need to. We've got Google and we've got written word. We do. We don't have to remember stuff unless you're doing an exam, and then you'll cram your information in, which then will probably literally, like I said before, goes in one ear and out the other within a few weeks because that's what you've done. We don't need to in a literate society, but in a non-literate society, if you're going to the synagogue or going to the early church to sing or pray or recite stuff, you need to know it off by heart. It's not written down. So it's people would have heard this. It would have been quite evocative for them. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion they would draw, that it's somehow saying that Jesus has the power of God when he stills the storm.
And there's lots of drama in both accounts.
Yes.
It's not just nature, it's not just things growing, it's a storm, it's massive and ferocious, and the whole dramatic impact of the story is very, I suppose, lends itself well to oral storytelling, doesn't it?
It does, because there's no point telling a monotone, monochromatic, boring story. People don't remember such stories.
And
they remember things with drama.
And water was meant to be going into the boat, which is said to have been going into the boat.
Yes, all three accounts talk about the boats getting swamped in some form or another. So it's very frightening. If you're out there on a lake, it's dark, there's thunder, there's lightning, there's wind, there's water coming into the boat. You're not going to be feeling real happy, are you, if you're a fisherman? No.
terrified.
And you've got to make sure there is probably a bit of exaggeration here because that's what makes people remember it,
Yeah.
because it's exciting.
And
then Jesus saves the day.
That Mark's gospel is different from the other two in this thing. He actually quotes, and it's in my version, the New English Bible. He rebuked the storm and said to the sea, in brackets, hush, be still. It's actually a quotation.
Mm.
It's not just he rebuked the storm. He actually spoke those words, and it's in inverted commas. So it's an actual quotation.
Well, according to that translator, it is, Derek. What you've got to remember is there's no quotation marks in the ancient Greek manuscripts that this is being translated from. But from context, people assume certain things. So there's an assumption that Jesus, and he does speak a lot of direct stuff in Mark. So there's an assumption that he is speaking directly, hence the translator has supplied the quotation marks. So I'm just having a look at what word is rebuke. And he spoke to the lake or the sea. Be still, be silenced is literally what it says. So shush is a bit of a modern interpretation of be still, be silenced. And the rebuke, I think that's an old-fashioned, again, translation. Yes, but he says to them, stop it, basically. Be still, be quiet.
So the incident takes place on the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee would have been quite familiar territory to at least some of the group of disciples, because as Mark tells the story, the first 4 disciples that responded to Jesus and left everything to follow him were actually men that made a living by fishing on that sea. So presumably they had become, from their trade as fishermen, they'd become quite used to the conditions on the sea, that lake. But in this story, the wind whips up quite a storm, and the sea becomes a wild place, a dangerous place, and that's, I think, quite an interesting element in the story. I think add that to the fact that Mark says here that they were crossing to the other side. They are on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Jewish side, the side of Galilee. But they set out to go east across the sea to the eastern side. And on the east is the Decapolis and Gaulonitis, which were territories that were Gentile territories, not Jewish territories. So Jesus here is setting out from Jewish territory into Gentile territory. And he does this not only here, but a second time in Mark's Gospel, later on in chapter 6, he actually sends the disciples, they're back on the western side in Galilee, but he sends the disciples across the lake to the other side a second time, and again a storm comes up, and that's where he meets them by walking on water. So what does it mean to go to the other side? And Mark makes quite a thing of the disciples and Jesus going from one side to the other. It's a later document, the Mishnah. It comes from the 3rd century, but it contains a lot of traditional rabbinic material. And one saying that's in the Mishnah is attributed to a rabbi who said that the lands of the Gentiles are unclean. And maybe that is an element of the symbolism that's happening in this story. We know that the Jews considered the land of Israel to be a holy land. It had been a land that was promised by God and given to them. And within the Holy Land, and we still call it the Holy Land today, even though what's going on there today is not very holy at all. But in the Holy Land, Jerusalem is the holy city, and Zion, the mountain in Jerusalem, is the holy mountain. And on top of Zion is the temple, the holy temple. And in the temple is the Holy of Holies, which is where the priests go once each year to atone for the sins of the people with God. So there's certainly a very strong emphasis on the holiness of the land. But to set out and deliberately go across the lake where Jesus will meet a quite an unclean, a very unclean, ritually unclean as well as physically unclean man, the man who's possessed by a demon and who lives in the cemetery. That's quite a striking symbolism. So crossing from holy Jewish territory across the lake into unholy, unclean Gentile territory is a very risky business. The first time they do this, there is a great windstorm. The second time, in chapter 6, there's an adverse wind. Both times Jesus has to rebuke the wind and calm things down. Or in the second time, he's walking on the water towards them and the wind calms then. And both times, of course, in each of these crossings, the disciples respond with utter amazement. They're astonished. There's some interesting symbolism going on in this story and its companion from later on in chapter 6. So that provokes us to invite you to think about, what do these crossing scenes tell us about the risks that were involved in stepping out beyond the familiar, the Holy Land, the land of Israel, across into the unknown Gentile territory, the unclean Gentile territory, and perhaps also for us to ponder what risks are involved when we cross by stepping out beyond the familiar, what is familiar to us, into unknown places for us and for our churches. What are the risks involved? So there's a set of questions there for you to ponder in the next discussion time.
So thinking about Mark now, not Matthew, who's still having conniptions, what's happening in terms of Mark? How radical is this?
Oh, it's radical, all right.
It's radical? Thank you, Matt.
Yeah. It's
Someone's going to jump in.
Because it's not as if it's taken for granted that Jesus is for everyone. There's still that underlying sense that there are Gentiles and there are Jews, and the fact that that's obviously an important backdrop to the whole story, that an understanding of the time, it seems to me, that there's this big division, and you see Jesus, a Jew, going across to the Gentiles. That's a massive thing.
It absolutely is. And as you continue, as Derek's pointed out, you've got this healed Gentile demoniac actually going into this Gentile territory as like one of the first missionaries, spreading this good news about what's happened to him. So if we extrapolate that to ourselves and our churches, how good are we at crossing to the other side and doing something radical?
Really bad.
Really bad.
That sums it up. Really bad.
Really bad. Anyone want to disagree with Matt?
Oh, it depends on the congregation.
No, I suppose it does.
Yeah, if we're looking at Tuggeranong, they've taken a plunge for a growth program, and that is not without its challenges, but there's no thought of bailing boat. If I'm seeing that we're talking about water, it's a matter of solving and continuing. So I think that congregations have challenges, and if they pull together, if the congregation's together, there's success.
That big word, if.
If, yeah. Congregations aren't fond of change. It's
especially if
hard.
they've got a history of forced change in the past, which is what we're dealing with. There's a lot of hurt left there from, churches forcibly being closed, and they've had to amalgamate, and they're literally hanging on to that hurt.
Yeah. Which isn't actually in the long run going to help them very much.
No.
But I've always said in all churches, people have pathological attachments to buildings.
Yes.
And it might be better if we saw ourselves as in boats that are temporary rather than in buildings that are forever. But that's just my opinion.
Because in boats, you're going somewhere. In buildings.
That's right. Yeah, a building is a static thing. And the building shouldn't be the church. The church is the people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, hanging on to buildings and hanging on to things that have happened because of buildings or losing buildings is really, what do you think Jesus would say about that?
He wouldn't be very happy about it.
He's having a lot to say.
Yeah, there'd be nothing good. So, sometimes we forget how disruptive the gospel is, about how radical Jesus was, how he did break rules, how he did do unexpected things, and how he dragged the disciples with him, even if they weren't quite understanding what was going on. He pulled them along with them, and it was such a successful endeavor, if you like. We end up with the Christian church.
Yeah.
And it's because Jesus, I suppose, dared to be different, and then his disciples were inspired to be different as well. If they'd stayed the same, nothing would have changed, and we would never have heard of him, probably.
And I know I said really bad, that we're really bad at change, and I'm also really bad at change. But in defence of the poor old disciples, there was a massive storm on that lake. It wasn't easy.
No.
And change does have risks, and that's the interesting part of the story. Is kind of saying, yes, do it, get out there. But there's a kind of realistic sense that there are dangers, there are risks involved as well.
It's an acknowledgement that we're going to feel fear. Because
yes, absolutely. And in our next exercise we're going to get you to do, we're going to do what we've done in the past, is get you to compare all the accounts that occur in Matthew and Luke, because each of them have this story. And there are some, you'll probably find Mark and Luke are fairly similar, but you're going to find Matthew's quite different in some ways, but it's the same story clearly. What we want you to do is think about how it's described in each gospel, because there's quite a serious difference. Your translation will have a windstorm in Matthew. It's wrong. It's seismos. It is not lilaps, which is what Mark and Luke have. So how is the disturbances described? Have a look at the sequence of events. One of the Gospels is different. What does Jesus speak? What is the response of the disciples? And just think about what comes before each of these. Have a look what the verses are, the sort of 10 to 15 verses are before each of these accounts in the Gospels. And then once you've done that, have a think about, is each evangelist telling a slightly different story about what it means to be a disciple?
Shucks.
How did you go with your comparisons? What did you find?
There were some differences.
I thought that the differences were just so fascinating, and it was just fascinating to see how Matthew was shaping the narrative by putting stuff before, and it was like implying or giving any reason other than what the other Gospels were doing. It was just absolutely fascinating to see what was going on there.
Yeah, Matthew's a bit different. in his wording and also his order. Did anyone pick that up? Matthew changes the order. Yeah, Jesus rebukes the disciples before he rebukes the winds.
Yeah.
Where in the other ones he rebukes the wind and then he says to the disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Yeah.
The biggest difference between Matthew and the other two is that Matthew doesn't say that they cross into the other side.
No.
Was he trying to shield his Jewish readers from suggesting that they're crossing into Gentile territory? I don't know.
It does in verse 18. If you go back a little bit, you'll see that now when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. You just got to go back a little bit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is when he comes to the countries, if you want to keep reading in Matthew, and you don't have to do that, Jesus never gets out of the boat. It's described in Mark, he steps out of the boat. On Luke, it says he steps onto land, not in the Gospel of Matthew. He doesn't get out of the boat, which is interesting. But yes, I think that you're on the right track, Derek. I think that there is a whole Jewish thing around here. And if you keep going with the Gadarene demoniac, you'll find that Luke and Mark have the account of the going through the Decapolis and proclaiming there, where Matthew, if I hold up my synopsis, you can see it. See that big tank in that column?
Yeah.
That's the Gospel of Matthew leaving out that part.
Yeah.
That's it.
But essentially, they're all telling the same story in different words.
Yes, they are. And they do have different audiences that someone said. And
Luke, of course, wasn't a witness. He's picked it up from other people. Matthew presumably was in the boat.
Well, I don't know that Matthew was in the boat. He seems to be writing from Mark, I think. But did everyone look at what comes before each of these stories?
Yeah.
What did you find?
It's all different.
It is all different. And how do you think that influences how you read the story?
Well, it totally it sets different contexts, it shapes the narrative, it bends the narrative to their theme. It's fascinating.
Well, let's have a look at Matthew. What comes directly before in Matthew? If you haven't got it in front of you, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go to the other side. But before they do, there's a little bit of dialogue. A scribe approaches and says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of his disciples said, "Lord, let me first bury my father." But Jesus said, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And then when you come to verse 23, it says, he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Now, have you noticed the verb that keeps reoccurring in Matthew?
Followed him.
Follow, that's right. It's akalutho in Greek. It's really important in Matthew. When someone follows Jesus, it generally means they're disciples. So here it says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And then Jesus says to someone else, "Follow me and let the dead bury the dead." And then he says he gets onto the boat and the disciples follow him. Where if you look at Mark, it says the disciples took Jesus into the boat with them. That would never happen in Matthew. Jesus always leads in Matthew. And if you look at Luke, it just says he gets into a boat with the disciples. It's quite egalitarian, where Matthew clearly says Jesus gives orders, Jesus gets in the boat, the disciples follow. There's a lot of emphasis on following. And that's what Matthew is setting up on his. What about Mark? What's Mark setting up? What comes directly before this story in Mark?
There's all the parables that he's been talking about.
Yes, it was the parables we looked at last week about the mustard seed and birds taking rest. And then it finishes with And with many parables, he spoke the word to them, and they were able to hear it. And he explained everything in private to his disciples. And then it's on that day when evening came, he goes across to the other side. So the crowd is left behind, but there's not great crowds around him as in Matthew.
No.
So it's a whole thing about this kingdom stuff, about it growing big. So what is one way you would grow it big? You go to
another place.
Another place, yes. You go to another place. So it's not about great crowds pressing on you like Matthew. You go to another place. And presumably, as Mark follows through on this story, you end up spreading the word, don't you?
Yeah.
Like the mustard tree. You've got the man in the Decapolis spreading the word all through the Decapolis. So Mark is setting up that scenario there. What about Luke? What comes before Luke? This story in Luke.
His family came to him, mother and brothers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he says to them, my mother and brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it. It's harsh, isn't it?
Yeah.
Saying something like that. So what's Luke doing then, having that straight before this story? What's he telling you?
Well, then it's almost as if he changes the subject.
You think he makes that
Because he
statement and then
says
runs
it
away
in
from
one
it.
day, he says.
Yeah. Or
He
maybe it's about discipleship. How would it relate to that? What's Jesus saying about discipleship?
Follow him or his family.
Yes. Yeah. That those who follow him are his family. To be a disciple is to be part of the family of Jesus. So when you have with the windstorm there, I guess it's about we're all in this together. Matthew changes the order. Why do you think he does that?
It's to influence his audience.
In what way?
Well, there must be issues going on that he's dealing with. So he's taking the opportunity of telling them how to handle things at the moment.
That's kind of right, I think. Does anyone want to expand on that a little bit? Because Matthew rebukes the disciples first. What do you think the point is he's making? Especially when we know he's talking about discipleship, because he's talked about follow. And so it's follow me. What point is he making?
That it won't be easy? That it won't be easy?
Yes, that's right, Maxine. You've got to have faith when the storm is raging, not when it's calmed down. Matthew changes that order. When they say, Lord, save, it's literally in the Greek, Lord, save. We perish. It's all in the imperative, and it's like a little creed, Lord, save. How we'd say, Lord, have mercy. And Jesus says doesn't still the storm as he does in the others. He says, why are you afraid in the middle of the storm? Then he gets up and tells it to be quiet. Where with the others, he quietens the storm and then says, why were you afraid? So in Matthew, the emphasis is on you have to hold yourselves together and not be afraid in the middle of the storm. And that's the point he's making. Discipleship isn't easy. Stormy times are coming. And you have to hold on while you're in the middle of it. You can't wait for me to turn up and turn it off.
Incidentally, there are two little things that Mark, for instance, has an eyewitness suggestion there. He was asleep on the cushion.
Mark likes those details.
But both Matthew and Mark use the nautical term swamped, where Luke apparently only says the boat was filling.
Yeah, there's slight differences in how they tell it. There is one big difference your translation won't have, and that is Matthew does not say windstorm. Matthew clearly says earthquake. A great earthquake arises on the sea, not a great windstorm. and it's a different word. It's seismos, it's lilaps in Mark and Luke, and Matthew has 4 earthquakes. When there is an earthquake in Matthew, it's highly significant. It's the divine breaking in. And the other 3 places are when Jesus dies on the cross, there's a big earthquake and the grave's open and people come out. When the stone is rolled away from the tomb, there's a big earthquake and all the soldiers fall down as dead. And then there's a big earthquake in chapter 24 to signal the end of time or the day of the Lord. So they're highly significant. When Matthew uses this word, he's saying there's an inbreaking of the divine. So I think you're right, Derek. There's something special going on in this version. Maybe not in the other ones, but in this version, it is no ordinary windstorm. There is something of much greater significance happening. The divine is breaking into the world and it's not going to be good. Well, it's not going to be easy. It'll be chaotic. There'll be storms. There'll be all sorts of things happening.
It'll be uncomfortable.
And it will be very uncomfortable. So Matthew is really driving home that point. But all of them are making a point about following Jesus and discipleship in their own ways, that is your new family, if you like, because we can imagine that as people started following Jesus, their families probably weren't very impressed. You may run the risk of losing your inheritance or being ostracized. In the Gospel of Mark, we've had this pointing towards this, great mustard tree with all these birds and critters in it, when we've got the healed demoniac man going all around the Decapolis and proclaiming how much Jesus had done for him and amazing everyone there. So all of them are telling the same story, but they've all got these slightly different emphases and pointing forward perhaps to something a little bit different.
And it's very early in Jesus' last year of ministry. The disciples have only just more or less joined him. Most of them have only just joined him.
Yeah.
And they still don't understand quite who he is.
I don't know that they understand who he is till the book of Acts, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, Mark's gospel, it hammers it again and again. They do not understand what's going on, even right up sort of later chapters. Yeah.
So, yes, any other comments people want to make about this?
I was just going to comment. I said to the group, it's an instance of the sort of things that happen when different people describe the same thing. If a group of people see an accident and you ask them to go and sit down and write down what they saw, you'll get as many descriptions as you've got people.
I think that's true. I'm not sure that's exactly what's happening here, Dorothy, simply because if you watch a car accident, now everyone's going to say it's a car accident, agreed?
Yeah.
They're not going to vary on that. They're not going to tell you it was an earthquake.
No. True. Yeah.
And I think you've got to say Matthew's picked that word quite deliberately, and it's not because he was telling a different story. It's because he's using a word to make a point. So I do think that it's partially right. People do remember stories differently and tell them differently. But I also think the writers of the Gospels shape that, and they do add in their little things. Because all of them have something quite different that precedes this story directly.
Yeah.
And one would assume they can't all be that far off the mark. But I think that they put things in the order they want to put them in, because all of the things they've used are in all of the Gospels, but they just changed the order.
Well, they're all oral, and so as they think about them, they write it down.
Yeah. And when they are writing them down, I suppose it gives them, in their opinion, license to add certain things like Matthew adding in an earthquake. Yeah. Any other comments or questions?
A question. So they all shape the narrative.
Yes.
Do you think of the three, and is Matthew the more shapery?
I think Luke shapes the gospel as much as Matthew, because we know that they're using Mark and they change Mark. And I mean, Luke alters Mark as much as Matthew does. It's just done differently. Luke is much more universal. He's much more accepting of Gentiles. He's much more having Jesus do a bit more daring things. In Luke, Jesus is in Samaria with lepers up there and stuff like that. Will you find that in Matthew? No, you will not. But Luke adds that stuff in to pull all these different people in. And I think he does as much reshaping, but he reshapes it in a way that we probably find more palatable than Matthew does.
Oh, I see. And so maybe Matthew, it seems more shaping because the message isn't maybe as amenable to how we understand things. Yeah.
I think so. We don't notice it as much in Luke, how much he's changing Mark, because it is more agreeable to what we see as Christian.
And of course, we have Mark as the presumed source for Matthew so that we can compare and see how Matthew might have shaped it. When I started off by saying that Mark probably wrote down collections of oral stories, we don't have those. So we can only hypothesize to what extent, how much or how little Mark has shaped the material. So there are learned tomes that have been written on the redaction or the editorial work of Mark, going from the non-existent source the presumably existent oral source that we don't have, to the written source, kind of retrojecting from what we see Matthew doing to Mark. So it's
and Luke doing to Mark.
Interesting speculation, but we can't actually pin it down. But presumably, Mark's a storyteller, so he shapes it to tell his story.
Yeah. And I mean, he's got his own trajectory, Mark, too, but we don't know his sources.
What is the literal meaning of Megali?
Big, great, large.
Great. And Lalaps?
Lalaps is a storm, a windstorm.
And the next question is, what understanding did the people of this time have of earthquakes and various geographical things?
Well, they did, because earthquakes happened in their area. I mean, the Middle East is on fault lines, so there are earthquakes that occur. So they knew what there was. Nobody mistook a very strong breeze for an earthquake, Pat. They're not that dumb.
I didn't mean that they were dumb.
Yeah.
Ignorant, maybe.
No, we're more likely not to understand an earthquake in this country, I think, simply because we don't have any. I would not have understood what an earthquake feels like had I not been in Newcastle when the Newcastle earthquake struck.
Yeah.
And it was completely different to what I would have imagined. So I think when you've experienced one, you're not going to mistake it. And the Sea of Galilee is known for these storms. It's quite these really raging windstorms that whip up quite suddenly, and they often don't last very long. And it's quite famous for them. I don't know it's famous for earthquakes, but certainly earthquakes occur in the Middle East.
Right.
So I think they knew what they were. And I mean, Matthew knows what it is. He has things happening like tooths being cracked open, stones rolling away. He knows an earthquake moves stuff.
Remembering back to a study that, many years ago that we did, if you compare the three Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, the stories they tell that are obviously taken from Mark being the first one, and Matthew and Luke have used Mark, they always leave out. Mark is always fuller in his descriptions of what went on. Almost
Yes,
all.
he is. I'm glad you said that, Derek, because I keep reading nonsense about Mark is in such a hurry, he summarises everything. No, he doesn't. He puts in fuller descriptions like there's a cushion that Jesus is asleep on. If you turn the next page on your Bible and go on to read it, you will find Mark has whole paragraphs that Matthew and Luke remove about how the demoniac behaves, about him howling and bruising himself and his chains and where they were and how he broke them to pieces and all this stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff in Mark that simply isn't in Matthew and Luke. I mean, Matthew removes nearly all of it.
Oh, there's a lot in Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark, but I'm saying that when it's in both all three of them, Mark is usually the fullest.
That's right. You're right. Absolutely, he is.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So he gives all sorts of stuff that you don't detail, you don't get in the others. And Luke, of course, adds in a whole lot of stuff very beloved of us. The story of the Good Samaritan, that parable. You know, there's things in Luke that don't occur anywhere else. And that's one of the things he does to Walter Mark, is add in all these other things about, like Samaritans being the good guy. How radical is that? Luke's very radical, but because it's closer to what we think of as Christianity, we don't see how radical it is and how much he's actually changed Mark.
Elizabeth, I'm probably quite wrong, but in my growing up years in the Methodist Church and selected congregations through life, there seems to be a greater emphasis and use of Matthew rather than Mark and Luke. Quoted more often, used more often.
Luke better.
Am I right in
that I knew Luke better?
I think it would depend on the church that you're in, Rosemary.
Right.
I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is used a lot. You will hear that cited a lot.
Yeah.
In the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew's Beatitudes are a bit more fulsome than Luke's, and he's got the fuller version of the Lord Prayer. So there's certain things in Matthew that people prefer to cite because there's more to them, more Beatitudes, longer Lord's Prayer, the whole Sermon on the Mount that we're beloved because we like to browbeat people over the head with a stick to make them behave in certain ways, and the Sermon on the Mount lends itself to that. But you won't hear any of the other stuff like, you know, Gentiles suck. I mean, Matthew doesn't quite say that, but he does, just in first century words. You know, you won't hear that one cited.
Yeah.
You won't hear the bit about following the law cited that Matthew says, do as the Pharisees teach you. That won't be quoted in too many pulpits, I'm guessing.
No. So we're
very selective what we pull out and want to use and why we want to use it. But we probably tell the stories from Luke's Gospel far more. The prodigal son, the story of the Good Samaritan, the whole nativity thing with Luke. Luke is much more popular in those stories, and we tend to see them as what it means to be Christian, where if we start pulling out bits of Matthew, it might terrify us. I've always said if I was meeting Jesus in a very dark, stormy alley, it would be the Lucan Jesus I'd want to bump into.
Well, Matthew's got a distinctly Jewish slant where Luke is writing essentially for Gentiles, I think, isn't it?
I think that's probably right, Derek. Yeah. I think Luke's probably got a mixed community, but he seems to have quite a few Gentiles. And we know there's Gentiles in Mark's community because he translates words.
Yeah.
So they know what it is, or he tells them of a tradition that the rabbis do, because clearly it's something they don't know. Matthew does nothing like that. He doesn't have to. He's got people who understand all of that. If you're interested in comparing them, you might consider purchasing one of these. Parallels, it's probably backwards. And what it is when I open it up, you can see you get all three side by side.
small one of those.
Yeah.
So it's
And you can easily compare. You can pick them up secondhand quite cheaply. And I found it very useful because you can see at a glance where there's differences. And, you know, is it something that you need to be worried about? Are they identical? And you can also see where Matthew and Luke gang up against Mark and change him and stuff like that. So they're quite interesting beasts to actually look at. But it's just called Gospel Parallels. But you can often buy them on eBay and places like that for $20, $30, and I find it quite useful. This one's the NRSV, but you can get them in other ones, and you can get them in Greek as well, but I don't imagine any of you are lining up for that.
No.
Right.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time. Next week, we're going to be looking at 2 healings in Mark. One is Jairus' daughter. I don't know if she's named in Mark or not, but certainly that's how it's known, the story. And also, of course, Jesus on the way to that particular healing encounters another woman who touches his clothes, and that's the hemorrhaging woman. So we'll be looking at those 2 things in Mark